it's finally coming to a head. There have been a series of pretrial motions, and the judge has step by step dealt with each one of them and moving the trial closer and closer to happening.
One of the things that I'm wondering, and I know that just the other day they had a hearing on this, is we're having to deal with the fact that you can't be forced to testify against yourself. But if they pull some DNA out from somebody else, they can link that person to you, which almost in effect makes you testifying against yourself. Or if you grab your DNA can speak against you. And that's an interesting concept that we haven't seemed to figure out completely, but it does seem to typically go in favor of the prosecution.
Yes, there has been some case law on this. And as the judge stated in this case, when he decided to use the DNA that was found, he said this was evidence left at a crime scene.
Right.
The murder of 4 people. There's no right to privacy for this defendant in this case.
But that, is there also a Fifth Amendment right? Where he can't be compelled, and how can his DNA not be him testifying against him? I wonder about that eventually.
Just like your fingerprints are left at a crime scene, that will tie you to the case and convict you. The DNA is being treated as fingerprints by courts of law.
Yeah. All right. So finally we're going to get to court. And I guess the next thing to say is this case is horrific. Like, that's the first thing. People have lost kids right at the beginning of their lives. And the big question you leave in the book quite often is why? And have you gotten any closer to a why? Do you think we'll ever get a why?
You are exactly right. Why did this happen? Why did someone go into a house in the 4 o'clock in the morning and kill 4 young people? We're never going to get an explanation that makes any rational sense. What's also interesting in this case is that there is really no tie between the suspect, the man alleged of committing these murders, and any of the victims. He did not follow them on social media. There's no evidence that he ever talked to them, there's no evidence that he'd ever been in that house. There's nothing that can tie him to them. However, if one wanted to make a hypothesis of what happened, I think that one of the young women Maddie Mogan, was a waitress at a restaurant in downtown Moscow, Idaho. He would frequent that restaurant. That's a matter of fact. Did they speak? Did they have anything? Maybe they didn't even need to speak. He seemed to have, I believe, became fixated with her. Obsessions came easily to him. He was a former heroin addict. And further documentation for this is you can go over the events of that night. What happened? When the suspect goes into the house, he enters, it's been established, through the kitchen door on the 2nd floor, the sliding kitchen door. On that floor, there are 2 bedrooms filled with students. He doesn't stop there. He's not on a killing spree. Instead, he walks up the staircase and turns to the right. That's Maddie's bedroom. As it happened, her friend was staying in her bed with her that night, Kaylee, and now he was confronted with 2 victims. That threw his whole plan out of kilter. But I believe his original intention was Maddie. That's just my hypothesis. We'll hear more at the trial, I imagine. But I don't think we'll ever get a reason that makes sense to a rational, normal person.
Brooke, thanks for coming into the show.
Yeah, I am curious, Howard. I haven't read your book, but does Kohberger have any previous signs that he would do something like this? Or you said he has a history of addiction, but does he have a history of like stalking or obsessing over any women?
His medical history, and this is going to be something that comes up in the trial, is fairly complicated. I go into the book how he suffered from something called visual snow. That's a doctors debate whether or not this is a psychological state or a medical state. What it means is you look at the wall through the world it looks like a test pattern. And when he's being tormented by this, he wrote as a teenager, that's when it would hit him most forcefully, that he felt like a piece of meat. He hated all around him. He felt he was capable of anything. He could not show any remorse. He was a character really out of Camus, The Stranger. He felt as he could have done anything. Then he was a teaching assistant at Washington State University at the time of the murders. And there's documentation with the professors that he worked with becoming more and more disgruntled with the way he was behaving. They had called him in 3 times, asked him to get, in effect, his act together. He was being rude to the students, particularly the women students. And this was all coming to a head. Finally, a week before the murder, he was called into the professor's office. They had a showdown. He was given a reprieve. And then one of the young women in the class complained that he was stalking her, that he followed her out to the car. And this was too much for the Washington State University. They were going to throw him out of the program. They were going to take away his fellowship, his teaching fellowship. And without the $28,000 a year that he needed, this was a real existential crisis. This was a young man who came from a very hard Scrabble community in the Poconos. He had continually reinvented himself. He lost 125 pounds at one point as a teenager. He kicks heroin. He was a mediocre student, yet he manages to go from a community college into DeSalle University and then get into a very distinguished graduate school. And he's able to do all this, change his whole life. But ultimately, I believe there was something in his nature he couldn't quite overcome. And he was just overwhelmed by events. And he reverted, I believe, this is my hypothesis, to the criminal, the madman, really, that he is essentially.
It's when you describe that, it's like, yeah, this thing's a slam dunk, but it doesn't appear to be a slam dunk. Otherwise, we would have already slammed him into the cell and left him forever, right? But how come? Yeah,
I think it will. I think the trial will be a slam dunk. I think the judge's most recent rulings have allowed the DNA evidence into the case. What the whole case focuses on is a knife sheath left on the bed of one of the victims. On this knife sheath, on the button of the knife sheath, they found touch DNA. They were able to process this DNA and eventually leads a trail that leads them, they believe, to Kohberger, that leads to his being arrested. However, without that bit of DNA, the case against him is pretty problematic. For example, there's no motive. The murder weapon, the knife that was used, has never been found. When Kohberger is arrested, there is no blood in his student apartment, at his family home. There are no blood or scratches on him. He's somehow able to kill 4 people in a matter of something like close to 14 minutes. How did this all happen? All they can do is have this DNA. If the defense can impugn this DNA, and that seems to be what they're trying to do. They've hired a new expert to join their legal team who specializes in DNA, a lawyer from San Francisco. If they can impugn it, raise enough questions, if they can also talk about other blood samples that were found on the scene, because this has just come out. 2 blood samples were found, one on a stair handrail going up to the 3rd floor bedroom, another on a glove outside the house. These bloods, they belong to 2 males, but that's all we know. If they can raise the possibility of accomplices, if they can raise a lot of questions, they have to go before a jury. The jury might be convinced that there is enough reasonable doubt not to convict him of murder. And because a murder in Idaho, well, a death penalty case can end in a firing squad. There's a law right now at the Idaho State Legislature where they're trying to make it that the firing squad is the only way that murder victims can be executed rather than lethal injections.
That's crazy.
And it's also, I believe, going to influence the case because a juror who's now doubts are being raised, they're going to have to decide, do I want to send this man off to a firing squad? There are many people in Idaho who might feel that way. The parents of one of the victims have understandably been talking out in support of this bill for a death penalty law by firing squad, and perhaps jurors will feel that way too.
I know that when we're desperate for a conviction, people do desperate things. Bill Cosby's not in jail because people cheated, and this happens routinely. And if I'm a lawyer in the defense, I'm going to look at New York City and all of the DNA problems they have with rape cases, where these should be cut and dry, right? Like there's DNA here and there's a problem.
Well,
yeah.
no DNA case is ever cut and dry. And this is not blood DNA they found on the knife sheath, it's touch DNA. And how were they able to tie that knife sheath to him? That's something that they've just been raising with the judge and trying to get it thrown out in pre-trial. They haven't succeeded, but they raised a lot of interesting questions. By this, I mean, when they found this sample of DNA, it was sent first to the Idaho crime lab to see if they could process it. Idaho couldn't do it. They sent it to a company in Texas, a cutting-edge technology company. It stays there for a couple of weeks, and they're having a hard time getting the connections. Finally, after a couple of weeks, the FBI comes in and says, we want it, and they demand the DNA. They take the DNA, and they're able to build out a family tree that leads eventually to Brian Kohberger, they allege. The question is, how were they able to build this family tree? It has now been revealed that the FBI, in their zeal to identify the killer and the zeal to get to the bottom of things, they use DNA sites that law enforcement is prohibited from using. They use two sites.
There it is.
The government, the defense rather, tried to raise this issue that this was the invasion of privacy, that they wanted to throw everything out. The judge said, finally, not so fast. Just the fact that it was found at the crime scene is enough. But this will be raised again at the trial. And now you're not necessarily convincing the judge, you're convincing the jurors. Will it work with the jurors? That's what we're going to find out. Because without that, they really have nothing. The alibi that was put forth for Kohberger by his lawyers is pretty thin gruel. It says at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the night in question, he was by himself in a wilderness park in the other direction from the crime scene, staring at the stars on a cloudy night when the temperature was below zero. That's what they're going with.
I have a question about that DNA evidence. Would there be a possibility that the defense would conduct their own DNA analysis of that?
Well, what the defense has done is brought in their own witnesses to try to impugn the government's investigation. They were the ones who discovered, these government witnesses, that the FBI played fast and loose with the rules. The FBI did not release their supporting documentation. They tried not to respond, and yet finally, the government, the Kohberger's legal team found enough evidence where the FBI had no hope but to admit that they had broken this agreement not to violate two genetic ancestry websites.
So did they get a warrant? It would seem like that's what you have to get a warrant, and some other judge has to say, yeah, you can break the rule in this case because, I'm authorizing it.
They didn't need a warrant to get access to the websites. This was evidence found at the crime scene because they didn't know who they were looking at. They were legally allowed to access several websites, but the ones that have the most data, the greatest inventory of family histories, those prohibit law enforcement from looking into it. What the FBI and the state are claiming, well, they did not violate people's privacy because they did not look for underlying medical conditions, whatever. They just tried to make a match, build out a family tree from the DNA they found at the crime scene. At one point, when they were trying to build out this family tree, they thought it led to 4 brothers, and they approached these 4 brothers who it's hard to differentiate in the transcript so far whether they were related to the Kohberger family. but one of these four brothers prohibited law enforcement from using his DNA. So they had to stop there. And it's this point, it seems, that the FBI moves in and starts sort of playing fast and loose with the rules.
Yeah, that's crazy. ahead,
Wasn't
Brooke.
there like a similar case with the Golden State Killer where they were able to find his DNA through like 23andMe or something like that? It seems like they would be able to test someone in the family that's close to him, that would be close to Kohberger, and then find it that way. Is that like a possibility?
Well, first they had to identify Kohberger. That's the whole big thing. How do they get
Oh,
to
gotcha.
Kohberger? And when they finally arrest him, on the night of his arrest, one of the first things the authorities do when he's in a jail in Pennsylvania, they take a cheek swab. And the DNA on the cheek swab matches the DNA on the button of the knife sheath. That would seem to be, case closed. And that's what the lawyers first tried, Kohberger's lawyers tried to get dismissed. They failed. What they're going to try to do now is ask the question, how did that knife sheath get on that bed? They're going to claim, I think, that Kohberger touched the knife sheath, but he was not the one who left it there. They are insisting, and there's evidence, there's really no proof that he ever was in the house. They're going to say that the actual killers, the people who left these unknown blood samples in the house, they brought the knife sheath there, and perhaps they had Kohberger touch it at some point. Will that, flimsy hypothesis hold up in the courtroom? We will see. It's just like the OJ case. They got away with the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. In the courtroom, strange things can happen.
Right.
If there's gloves and other blood evidence that shows males, isn't the prosecution obliged to figure out who those people are?
The defense said exactly what you're saying. They had to figure this out. They said that wasn't necessary. We taking this pack, this we know was definitely tied to the crime scene. It was found in the sheets of the murder victim. But the question you're raising will be raised time and time and again at the trial.
Yeah.
And as I will say, the Kohberger defense team has just gotten rid of one of the lawyers on the team. They put him into a subordinate role, to be an advisory role, and replaced him with a lawyer, Ms. Barlow from San Francisco, who's an authority on DNA, who knows the ins and outs of it. And they will try to kick up as much dust as possible and to confuse the jury. But I think, quite frankly, once you've made the match of the cheek swab DNA and it's in Idaho, they're going to have a hard time getting Kohberger off. I think this is a death penalty case, which is going to result in a conviction.
How comfortable would you be sending somebody in front of a firing squad based upon 20 cells of skin DNA? I mean, that freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I would raise the questions of, a liberal New Yorker, even sending someone in front of a firing squad. Yeah. What's interesting, a death penalty case just last summer in August, the way before they had the firing squad where they did lethal injections, they took a 72-year-old prisoner out of his cell for a lethal injection. They tried 8 times. 8 times the man's lying down there and they couldn't get the injection to work. His lawyers then at the end of this say, well, he's been through enough, let him go. The governor of Idaho, Brad Little, said, no way, we're bringing him back at some appointed time for another try.
Jeez, that seems cruel and unusual. For sure, unusual.
I mean, that's what they first tried to do, the Kohberger's lawyer, that even the death penalty was cruel and unusual. They're trying everything to do, we began our conversation, why 3 years? They're trying everything to delay. Lawyers, there's an old saying in the law, when you have the facts, you pound the facts. When you don't have the facts, you pound the table. And they've been, for the past 3 years, they've been pounding the table quite a bit.
Yeah. It's Yeah, I mean, it's horrific, right? But the police have a history, and I'm saying the police like they're all the same person, but they have a history of once they think they have their guy, they don't look at anybody else. Yeah, I had a guy on the show, Casson, and he's an expert on false confessions. And he's like, I can see it right away. I get called in, I can read it within minutes. I know that there's a problem. And he's like, one of the rules is, and he has all kinds of examples of this, of like, once they think they have their guy, they don't ever bother even going back after the person's exonerated. If their DNA after 20 years, or they don't ever go back and look at anybody else. It's like they're incapable of considering another option. I'm not defending anybody's bad behavior. Kohberger saying yes or no. I don't know. He's presumed innocent, right? But gosh, you just have to don't you have to exhaust these leads to some reasonable extent? If you've got DNA on site, and then I'm supposed to believe, I mean, without, a reasonable doubt that this sheath is there with this tiny bit of that, but there's no other DNA anywhere in the house.
There's
That
no
seems
other DNA. There's no other blood. There's no other blood on Kohberger. And yet you have this sheath in the bed of the woman who was killed, and it matches his cheek swab DNA. The question is, how did they make this journey? For nearly 7 weeks, they're trying everything, and it's really not working. They have pictures of cars in the area, a white Hyundai Elantra. The FBI tries to identify this car using all sorts of high-tech computer equipment, and they get 3 different dates for this car. In all the photographs they have of this car on the night in question, well, there's no picture of the license plate, and there's no picture of anyone behind the wheel. So you really can't tie Kohberger to that. Then you have the cell phone triangulations that put him there. Well, cell phone triangulations are very broad at best. They put him within 10 miles, a radius of 10 miles of the murder house. In a town like Moscow, you can be going to lots of different places. And then when they're tracking them, they seem to lose him for a 7-minute stretch. A lot of questions are going to be raised. And what the real tragedy might be, and I've written a bit about this, is I believe they have the right man, but they really haven't built an airtight case as of yet in the courtroom. Perhaps they're holding onto more evidence. We'll see that. But look at what recently has been revealed, the eyewitness testimony. On the night of the killing, the suspect leaves 2 young women, untouched. One of them, Dylan Mortensen, goes out of her room. She hears these noises 3 different times. Finally, she sees a man dressed in black, wearing a mask with bushy eyebrows, she says, an athletic build, about 5'10" or a little bit taller. The authorities use this to help identify Kohberger, and they use this in their affidavit for arrest. It now turns out that this was just one interview. They interviewed her a total of 4 times. And in the subsequent interviews, she admitted, according to the Kohberger defense team, that she had been inebriated that night. She didn't know if she was dreaming. And when she was shown a photograph of Kohberger just prior to his arrest, she said, quote, "I don't have a clue who that is." So this eyewitness identification is also going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, that's crazy. Given Kohberger's state of mind, probably losing his fellowship and having to reset his life once again, is this an attempt for a psychopath to just get himself off the streets because he can't control that beast anymore? I mean, that's not going to be anything that happens in court, but what's his motivation? Is it that? Could he be protecting everybody from him because he's lost control?
I don't think that's it, by judging by his courtroom demeanor. He and his lawyers have, insisted on his innocence. His lawyer, one of them, has said in courtroom, by putting an arm paternally around him, said it's an honor to defend him. He also, when he was driving, after the murders, 2 weeks later, his father comes out from Pennsylvania and they drive back across country. He's going home for the holidays. During this cross-country ride, father and son, according to the people I've spoken with, Kohberger confides to his father the problems he's having at school with the administration, but he says, they're just victimizing me because I demand high standards, and I'm going to go back after the holiday. I'm going to make my case, and I'm going to argue. at the same time, it's also come out that Kohberger knew something was happening. On the night of the arrest, and this was just revealed just last week, he hears at a little after 1 a.m, helicopter flying above, and he's seen moving from room to room and going into the garage, and the car opens. Is he getting something out? Is he putting something in? But he seems to be aware that he's been on the run in a sense, and the walls are suddenly closing in on him.
I know, so I used to be a spy, and we would do surveillance, and we would also have reports on be on the lookout for these things. And it is really hard to identify a car. And this kind of goes along the lines of eyewitness, testimony, where he's like, is it actually true? This is a specific example. The car is a white Plymouth, whatever. And I'm sitting and looking at the car that was parked because I was there when the guy parked. And I'm like, that is not a Plymouth, whatever. That is a Dodge Durango. And the person's like, no, it's 100% a Plymouth, whatever. And I'm like, but I'm looking at it. And here's the license plate that you read. It is not. I mean, look, maybe they changed cars, right? But it's that hard sometimes. I mean, completely different. I don't remember what the cars were, but they were completely different models of car. Maybe they were both Dodges or something. But so many times, like in Iraq, like we're looking for a blue Hyundai Elantra, whatever it was. And so if you saw a white one, you're like, was it blue in the nighttime sky? You didn't know. It was really hard to sort things out by car. That kind of evidence. If I was in a jury and someone was talking about identifying somebody by a car, maybe I would automatically, from my experience, be like, not a chance that they know what they're talking about reliably. Not enough to put someone in front of a firing squad. I wouldn't say the person was innocent, but yeah, that kind of evidence is going to be when there's nothing else and you're relying on these 20 cells, and they couldn't even get it right forever. Gosh, that just seems to me to be very suspect. Not even, you said not airtight. It's not even close.
No, it's problematic. And also, when the FBI was identifying this car, as I said, they said it was a 2010 to 2013. So when the Washington State University police are looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, and they find one parked outside the graduate student housing, and they send the information to the Moscow Police Department. There's just 10 miles between the two college towns. Moscow says, well, it's the wrong year. They leave it in the file, and the case goes on and on for another 3 weeks until the FBI plays fast and loose with the DNA to get this identification.
Yeah, crazy. Sorry, Brooke, I've been taking over the questions for a minute there.
No, not at all. I'm just wondering, what do you think is the most reasonable thing that the defense will come up with that would disqualify Kohberger? Like, it seems like there's a lot of little things, but there's not one like smoking gun that would make it to where there's no way it could have been him. Like, if his alibi is that he was out in the woods in the middle of the night, like that, just nothing checks out.
Right. I think the case that the defense is going to make ultimately is, what evidence do you have against him? Would you send a man to face potentially a firing squad if you don't have a murder weapon, you don't have a motive, you don't have any proof of interaction between him and the students, and all you have is this little bit of DNA, which is his? Well, I think they'll concede that perhaps, but how did it get there? Could someone have taken that knife sheath? Could he have touched that knife sheath at some point? And then someone else had left it there, the actual murderers. The judges talked about the defense raising the issue of accomplices. I think this will become stronger and stronger. But I think ultimately he will be convicted. If he were innocent, if the case against him was so circumstantial, where any lawyer let him sit in jail for 3 years and not rush this to trial, if they had an alibi that was any better than him going off at 4 a.m. on a freezing night to sit in a wilderness park on a cloudy night and stare at the heavens, that too is pretty problematic. And then when he's arrested, what is he doing? When the police come into the house, they burst in. It's a special emergency response team led by Pennsylvania state troopers as parents home in the Poconos. He's sitting there in a black hoodie sweatshirt, putting his personal garbage into plastic bags so it won't go out in the trash can, so it can't be picked up. That too is a bit incriminating. There, you know, they have, I believe, the right man, but I don't know if they have, as I keep on saying, I don't know if they built the right case.
Well, he seems to think he's like committed the perfect crime. Sounds like he has like some narcissistic tendencies that he just thinks he's so much smarter than everyone else. So it sounds like that's what he's leading with, is that they just don't have a good enough case against me. And so that's what he's going to use.
And what is interesting to me, he did commit the perfect crime, except for one small error, leaving the knife sheath behind because he entered a room where he only expected one person, and now he had to struggle with two. And one of them fought back, as her father said, like a tiger. There were scratches all over her body and wounds. And that really threw off his plan. But if he hadn't left that knife sheath, I think they still could be looking for the killer.
Right.
How does someone get in that bad of a scrap and not leave? I mean, if I'm the lawyer, look, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know how these things work, but what does it take to get that amount of touch DNA, only that amount, on a knife sheath? You know, maybe he touched it at Walmart. I mean, and no other. Yeah.
And even more, the house there were torrents of blood in the house. Coming out of the foundation of the house, there's photographs of the blood leaking out of the wall boards and leaking down the side. Cops who were there have described the worst crime scene they've ever seen. One possible explanation is the authorities have found that Kohberger bought a blue Dickies work suit in the weeks before the killings. Could he have been wearing that work suit? Could he have taken that work suit, kept a garbage bag in his trunk of his car, put the work suit in there, the murder weapon, and then chucked it into a river, an Idaho river, on his driving around afterwards? That's one thesis I think the defense will try to make. But again, there's no proof of all that. They also are going to try to make the case that he had a knife like the murder weapon. Is that a crime? A lot of people in Idaho have knives. A lot of people have bushy eyebrows in Idaho or any state. You have the only eyewitness who can't identify him. But you do have, we come back to it at the end, and it convinces me, and it might convince the jury, you have cheek swab DNA that matches the DNA on the knife sheath. I believe that if they could have thrown out the DNA evidence last week, if they succeeded in that, then there would be a case of them getting off. But after that, I believe, after they fail there, the trial will be pretty much a done deal. I think the case is closed.
It's crazy. It's crazy, right? So yeah, what is the defense going to do? And gosh, if his alibi changes, you know, like if he's like, all right, here's where I really was. I was over at Dave's house and I just didn't want to say it. That's not going to help at all either.
No, he also waited. His alibi was first filed, and he said he wasn't at the murder scene. He was driving around, and the judge said, "Well, that's not good enough. I can't consider that an alibi under the rules of evidence in Idaho law." So he waits, I think, 8 months before fleshing out the alibi, and we finally 8 months later get the story about his being in a wilderness park in Washington state. If that was indeed the case, I believe we would have gotten a lot sooner.
I'm curious, is there anyone close to him who thinks he did it, or for the most part, are they defending him?
Well, I write about in my book, When the Night Comes Falling, this cross-country trip he takes after the killings with his father. And his father, this is nearly a 30-year-old man, the son, and the father has to come out with him once he goes to school and when he comes home from the holiday. The father is concerned. According to the reporting I did, when the father first meets him, he realizes that Brian is out of sorts. And during the course of this journey home, the father is he's following footsteps in the snow, and he suddenly realizes these footprints are bloody. I use that metaphorically, that, oh my gosh, my son is a murderer. But can he go too far? At one point, according to the reporting I've done, once they're back home in Pennsylvania for the holidays, one of Brian Kohberger's sisters, becomes concerned by his brother's behavior. They know the murders took place just 10 miles away from where he lived. He seems to be obsessively cleaning his car. And she confronts the father. And the father said, we might have a real situation on our hands. And the father, who's been reaching this point in his own mind, still, this is a bridge too far. This is a Rubicon he can't cross. He can't make this realization that his son is this kind of monster. And he just walks out of the room. And so, to this point, at least, Kohberger's family and parents have been supportive of him. Will they attend the trial? I don't know.
Oh, interesting question.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's just so hard. I mean, when you're a parent and you see your kid, you don't see a murderer, even if it might be them or even it is them, it's still hard to accept. On the other side, if you have a kid that struggled like he has, you don't want to just throw him in the murderer bin because, kids struggle, and you're like, yeah, my kid struggled. He's into this whole crime thing, so of course he's becomes that guy absolutely is obsessive compulsive as far as what you've described, right? So of course he's bagging his
and
on
here
the
you have
normal
this
side.
father.
Yeah.
The father was the custodian at the high school that Kohberger went to. His mother was a special education teacher, and the father makes all these sacrifices for the son, and he's extremely proud of him, of this journey he's taken from basically a heroin addict to find the strength to kick heroin. We all know, or we've all heard stories about how hard that is. And he finds the strength to do that. He finds the strength to lose 125 pounds. He wants to be a normal person. The father wants him to be normal, and yet he can't quite make this journey. Another story I tell in the book is when Kohberger first comes out to graduate school, he's invited to a party, a student party just before classes start at a apartment complex called the Grove in Moscow, Idaho. And he goes there, and it's a swim party. There's lots of kids there. There's music playing. There's a barbecue. And he's talking to one of the people I interview, and he sees two pretty young women. They're both in, as it happens to be, black bikinis. And he suddenly gets up and he approaches one. And he asks for her phone number. And he gets it. And he then asks for the other one's phone number. And he gets that too. And the guy he's with tells me, oh my gosh, he's a real player. I mean, this guy is something. And yet, after getting those phone numbers, Kohberger immediately decides to leave the party. The women forget about the incident, the man who asked for their phone numbers. After his arrest, they remember that shortly after the party, they started receiving hang-up calls. Was this Kohberger? Well, now they hypothesize that it very may well have been. So he was someone who could only take his life so far. He couldn't really become normal. And I think what happened is these students, the four who were killed, their house, off-campus house of the three ladies who were killed, it was a party house. People would hang out there all the time. You can see videos of the police responding to noise complaints. And these kids were young and beautiful and exuberant. And Kohberger, I believe, was watching from the sidelines, seeing all this happen, and he was excluded from this world. And he never could find a way into this world. And it's my hypothesis that this is the only way he could deal with this. The only way he could live in this world, if they somehow were excluded from it, then he could find a way to function. Again, that, I got a B- in psychology at Stanford. What do I know? But I think it's something like this, and maybe we'll get more insights in the trial. But until then, it's a terribly perplexing case, and a case that ends in tragedy. It's left the parents of these children, every day waking up with this pain. Some of them want to attend the trial. Some of them are for a firing squad. Some of them just don't want to be involved. My heart goes out to all of them. I write about one of the fathers who is not accepting the police investigation. He wants to make sure that justice is done. He goes out in his own trying to build a case. He goes into dead ends. He's conned literally by a con in prison who thinks he's telling him things, but he can't quite put all the pieces together. But he wants to do what's right for his daughter even now. And to my mind, this man is, a hero in his own way, trying to just not let things happen, just not go gently into the good night, but try to control events that are unfortunately beyond his control. That's the tragedy of it all.
You bringing up the dad in your book, you write about his deconstructing the case to try to figure out something that was missed or whatever. And it sounds like he might have identified one of the protected sources in there, and that's an interesting thing. You're an investigative journalist. You talk about your requirements to protect sources. Have you found anything out? Do you think that was missed by the defense or by the prosecution or both in what you've done with the people who've confided in you and what you've been able to find?
What the one thing that I believe that disagrees with the standard understanding of the case is, when did the FBI get involved? When did they have their suspect? They claim that on December 10th, they took the DNA information from the Texas company that was looking at it, and it took them till December 9th to identify it. I think because they looked into areas where they weren't supposed to look, they got it a lot earlier, maybe even 2 or 3 days after they got the information. And therefore, when Kohberger and his father were going across country, I believe the FBI was following them, but they still had not told the Moscow authorities because they did not want to reveal how they had gotten their information. They did not want to impugn the case. They were trying to build more and more of a case against Kohberger before they shared the information. Again, that's my thesis. A lot of people disagree with it, but that's how I feel after having looked into the case.
Brooke?
I'm stuck on you saying that maybe Kohberger was watching from outside the house and observing them. And I think that's a really interesting point, because he stays in school or associated with school for his whole life, but he's 30 years old. So it seems like he's like trying to relive that, or like trying to get in with like this young crowd. But a lot of times, like 21-year-olds look at a 30-year-old guy and they're like, who's this old guy? Like, why would he be here? So it's almost like they wouldn't let him in because of his age. And so he like took control of the situation. So, I mean, I think that's a very astute hypothesis that he had watched them.
I mean, he's watching, and he's also warring with himself. On the night in question, when the murders occur, a white Hyundai Elantra goes by the murder house at some time after between 2 and 4 in the morning, not once, not twice, but 3 times. I don't think he was stalking the house. If he was stalking the house, he would have noticed, or someone would have noticed, all the cars parked in front. There were too many people in there. He would have seen a DoorDash delivery of food at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. He would have known that people were up. What I think he was doing, he was warring with himself. He was trying to say, I don't have to do this. Let me get away. Let me drive off. And he drives off. But each time, the forces, like a magnet, are pulling him back in until finally, after the 3rd time, he stops on top of the hill and finds the strength of Hercules to turn off the ignition of his car. And then he's committed as he walks down this icy slope of the back of the house with a knife sheath in his hand, this K-bar knife in the sheath. I think then he's committed to being a killer. And then his mind is made up, but he's fighting against it. He finally realizes, the assailant, whoever it is, realizes, I have to become this monster. But it's a battle internally until he can make this commitment to be the monster that he feels inside him. He's trying his best to be someone different, someone more normal.
Was the house normally locked? You said he comes in the second window, right? That seems like a crazy thing. He has to either know that, he's either set that
Well,
up,
it was a
or just
party
climbs.
house. There's a sliding kitchen door. And I think if he was observing the house, he would have seen that people went in there all the time. Or maybe he just got lucky. Again, there is no connection between him and either the house or any of the
Right.
students, or even stalking them on social media. There's nothing there that can tie him directly. The only thing that was ever in the house, there's no blood, no other DNA, is this one bit of touch DNA on a knife sheath, and he could have touched that knife sheath anywhere.
Yeah. And you talk in the book a little bit about there's two people in the house that survive, the one witness, and they don't say anything for hours. And so how was that going to inhibit or help the case?
That's, one of the mysteries of this case. Dylan Mortensen observes someone, as she said, clad in black, wearing a mask at some point, 5'10", 10-ish, with bushy eyebrows, athletic built. And she sees him, and he stares at her. And I think at that moment, if she had screamed, if she had said anything, I think she would have been killed. I think at that moment, she was locked, as she describes it, as a frozen panic state. I think the assailant was locked in his own mania. I don't think he even really noticed her. He goes out. But what's interesting, she goes back to her bedroom. She's talked about in subsequent interviews with the authorities that have been released that perhaps she felt she was in a dream. But she doesn't do anything. And not for 8 hours. And then when she does something 8 hours later, and there's so much blood in the house and there's been so much noise, she doesn't call the authorities. She calls friends at a fraternity house, and they come over and they discover the bodies. And then about noon the next day, they notify the police.
Wow.
That's
I mean,
crazy.
it's not so unreasonable that she wouldn't say anything or think anything of like seeing someone in her house. If it is a party house, it's like, it could be anyone. It could be someone's late night hookup or something. So, and especially if she's super drunk, then yeah, I don't think you can place too much weight on what
That's
she has
one
to say.
possibility. Interestingly enough, in the transcripts that were just released last week, and they've been redacted in parts, but she says in one interview, which was released last week, that she thought the person she saw dressed in black was holding a vacuum-like device. What does she mean by that? Does she mean a little handheld vacuum cleaner, or was it just a knife, and that's in her drunken state, that's how she interpreted it? That's something else that perhaps will come out in trial. But if this is someone trying to create the perfect crime, did he actually go there with a vacuum? To me, that seems absurd. I think she just couldn't quite identify what she saw, but this will be
Especially
expatiated on
giving
in the
his
trial.
hand-to-hand fighting with that one victim. It seems crazy.
Well, he took the knife with him at the end. He was carrying whoever the assailant was carrying the knife, because to this day, it's never been found.
And then, are they sure it's a K-bar knife, or is it just something that's
Well, they have
8
the
inches
knife
long
sheath.
and point?
No, they have the knife sheaths. There's a K-bar knife sheath. It's embossed with the U.S. Marine logo. It's for sale at lots of hunting goods stores.
But those two things don't have to go together. Like a knife sheath, like if the weapon was something else, but was another kind of knife or whatever.
Also, the coroner has made vaguely worded descriptions of the knife wounds on the different people. She's described them in different ways. I think that's probably just a coroner who might have been in over her head. She was a local nurse before she became the coroner in this small town. But
oh boy,
the defense might raise those issues too. I mean, there's a lot to raise. There's a lot of dust to kick up.
Yeah.
But is it enough to cloud the eyes of the jurors? That's what will make this trial interesting.
There's hunters all over that town, and a hunter has 20 kinds of knives. Like this, just And I'm not saying again that he did or didn't do it, but how do we know it's? I mean, maybe I'm not a coroner, so I'm going to shut up about this.
And the problem is that maybe the coroner in the town wasn't really a coroner either. So,
Right.
Yeah. That's like the RFK, assassination thing. Apparently, the coroner's like there were contact wounds to the back of the head, and you're like, okay. By the way, so you stood at the house. Were you there when it was still erect, or was it just after they had demoed?
Yeah, no, I was there. I one of the reasons I got out to this case, fairly early. I at my Thanksgiving table was November 26th in Connecticut, wherever it was just 2 weeks after the murders, and people were talking about it, and that's when I started talking about it as a father, as someone who likes plugging into stories, and I went out, within days, and I was able to talk to people before the gag order took place. Even I was able to talk to people in law enforcement, people at the university, and to go by the house.
Yeah. I want to just for everybody. This is Howard. His book is about these Kohberger murders up in Idaho, and it's a crazy book. Super great. I read it. Actually, I've read it 3 times now, just because there's so much detail in it. I wanted to be able to converse with you about it. But the link is right there. You guys can see that. Make sure you go that. You know what I always say, buddy read. Buy 2. You and a friend read it and come up with your own conclusions. I mean, that's like the thing to do. So I wanted to make sure we plug the book and plug your work in general. I mean, it's fantastic. If this thing comes back innocent and it flips and it's pretty obvious that he didn't do it, right? I mean, obviously today we think the opposite's true. How surprised will you be? I mean, like, where are you at? Are you 60-40? Are you 59, 41? Or where's your percentage, would you say?
I'm 95% or more that he's guilty. More, I mean, I believe he's guilty. I'm 80% sure they'll get a conviction.
And then how many people are involved in this case? Is it 1 or is it 2? Is it more?
I think it's 1. I mean, if there were more people involved, there would have been at least more blood evidence from other people. I don't think a secret could be that well kept in any sort of drug conspiracy. There would have been more different cars in the area. I just think nothing really else would make sense. But this is why we have trials in America. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. At least we still have trials, I think. Yes.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I want to ask this. Wait, hold on. I went to lie to Brooke and cut her off. Shut up, Brooke. All right. If I run a DNA company and the FBI didn't do what they're supposed to do, I no longer can say, "Hey, your stuff's protected here." I'm going to file a tort case. I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to file a tort case and be like, "Hey, you can't do that to my business."
Not only can I believe, and again, I'm not a lawyer. I have a daughter who's a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. Yeah. I think the people whose DNA they looked at, Kohberger's relatives, they can file too. I think the Justice Department can file against the FBI agents who committed these infractions. I think there could be a lot of subsequent cases.
Yeah. Sorry, Brooke. I'll let you talk for real now.
No, I'm just curious. Do you think there could be a mistrial or a retrial where they don't include the DNA evidence?
No, I mean, I think the judge has made it clear that this DNA evidence is going in, and with that ruling by the judge just last week, he's made it clear, in my mind, that Kohberger was going to be found guilty.
Wow.
But that almost guarantees an appeal on that decision right there. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
that's a lock.
They were trying also what I was surprised about, the defense was arguing for a Franks hearing. This is a hearing that the authorities had falsified evidence or used inappropriate, not revealed everything to the magistrates who issued the search warrant. And I thought the judge, just to protect the case on appeal, would say, okay, let's have a pro forma Franks hearing. He waited 2 weeks, considered everything, reviewed the evidence, and he said there's not even enough in his mind for a Franks hearing.
Wow.
That's perhaps might be an issue for appeal down the road. I think there'll be many appeals. Perhaps so a conviction will give the parents and the survivors some sense of closure.
Is Kohberger, is he being held right now, or is he?
He's in prison in Boise. First he was in a smaller prison in Moscow, Idaho, and then when the trial was moved to Boise, he's now in a larger population. I assume he's kept in isolation. He attends all the court hearings. He's in a business suit. He's well shaved. He's getting a lot of love letters from people. It's been reported in the press. So people are fascinated with him, and there are young women who seem to think not only he's innocent, but he would be a good companion.
How does the liberal New Yorker you feel about an innocent person being held in prison right now, pre-trial?
If I thought he was innocent, I don't, I would be asking his lawyers, why are you keeping him there? Why don't you have, let's make things move quicker. Let's not be raising all these different motions that are going to be defeated. Let's try to get to the bottom of the things. At the same time, you're asking, why did the FBI not give all the information they had? Why did they violate the prohibitions against their going to certain websites? Why did they then destroy their work notes? The work notes, that's the other part.
They destroyed their work notes?
They don't say they've destroyed them. I'm using that would be the wrong verb. The verb would be that they've somehow disappeared.
Oh my God.
They don't know where they are. They didn't think they needed to be kept. Was it inadvertent? Was it deliberate? Again, I don't know.
I mean, he's going to go to jail, but he's going to get off at some point, is what you're telling me. Like, that's what I hear.
Well, we'll see. I think his life is over. I think I think this will be a death penalty conviction.
Yeah, crazy. Brooke, what do you have to say in closing?
I have to side with Howard on this one. I mean, it sounds like I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk, but it's like a 3-pointer for sure.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
3-pointer. That's good. That's good.
Okay.
And now, by the way, this has been awesome. And thank you so much for spending time with us. The case is fascinating. And wait till they get into the courtroom. Oh my God. We loved Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. Wait till we get this going on. We get him and that Mangione guy in the courtroom at the same time. People are going to lose their minds. People are going to get pregnant. It's going to be crazy. Anything you want to say in closing, Howard?
No, just thank you for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everybody, I'll see you all tomorrow. I'll talk to you guys in a second.